Hello. Is it on? Yeah. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to have Timothy Hyman here, a very distinguished painter in his own right, a lecturer, a writer, and a curator. He's a bit of his fraction of his CV. He's had 10 solo London shows. He had a show at the RA last year of work made from the residency at Maggie Centre. He's the author of a number of books, the author of Sienese painting, that was published in 2003, and a book on Bonnard in 98, published in 1998. And the new book, which is published just this Thursday, The World New Made, Figurative Painting in the 20th Century. He contributed an essay to the catalogue for the Bhupen show, which he's going to talk about at Tate Modern. He curated the Stanley Spencer retrospective at Tate Britain, and he also curated the 2000 Carnivalesque show that was a touring show. It went to Brighton, Edinburgh, Nottingham, all over the country. Also, from a personal point of view, he gave, for me, one of the most memorable lectures that I've ever attended to on Bonnard, I remember. It was absolutely amazing. So it's with great, great pleasure that I recommend Tim to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me perfectly? Yeah? All right. So tonight's talk, which will end, I hope, at 6 or just before, but we don't think there's anyone coming after us, so we could extend question and answers for anyone who isn't dying to leave the room. Obviously you can leave. Please don't hesitate, all right? But I think with an audience this big, I like having interruptions to my lectures, but I think we probably can't do that today. But so hold your horses until 5 to 6, all right? The brief I have is to combine talking about Bhupen Khakhar, which is this, I think, pretty extraordinary retrospective, probably something that won't be repeated for 30, 40 years at the Tate. It's not an ideal retrospective. I might say a bit about what makes it not ideal, but nevertheless, it's as good as you'll get, I think. And to combine that with having just published on Thursday my biggest and perhaps my last book, which is really trying to delve into the whole issue of so-called figurative painting, which is a very large category. It's not a survey. It's trying to speak always about specific artists and specific paintings. So I called it, one of the subtitles of the introduction is Episodes from an Alternative History. And of course the alternative is alternative to the one that I was given when I was at Slade, and probably even Andrew was given when he was a student, which is roughly, you go from Cubism to Mondrian or other kinds of abstraction to American painting, and then perhaps things get complicated, you probably drop painting altogether. And that would be the Rosalind Krauss view. Any of you know art since 1900, which is kind of the canonical text these days. No painting after 1980. No Guston would be represented. So, from that point of view, painting has withered away after 1980. I don't believe it. I think painting was very, very alive in the 21st century. But I think it will continue to be so right through the 20th. But funnily enough, in my view, there's no book that is, as it were, dealing with the same perspective. So, let me just start from the Bhupen point of view. I was asked to contribute an essay to this, perhaps 8 or 10 essays in this chapter, just a short 2-page essay about the way that Bhupen related to Sienese painting, the painting done in Siena between, say, 1300 and 1450, which he was passionate about, and I've always been passionate about. And before I went to the Slade, I had spent a couple of months in Italy, and the high point was this particular room, which is called the Well-Governed City, the painting on the right, part of a room where big decisions of government were made. I then arrived at the Slade, next slide please, and it was the high point of American abstraction, more than that, of colour field painting, or whatever you like to call it. I mean, all these categories are awfully silly. Bartlett Newman didn't call himself colour field painting. Nobody called themselves abstract expressions. But most of you probably by now have been to the Royal Academy show that's on now. So I'm partly bringing that in because the contrast will be so striking, I think, between these two sets of values. And it was very hard for me as a little 17-year-old, baby, coming straight into the Slade at that moment, when the painting on the wall there is huge, called Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow and Blue? I was afraid. I had to drop all my ideas about narrative, about storytelling. And it took a long, long time to regain, another one please, to regain those possibilities for my own painting. And I think that was true of a whole generation that were pretty much overwhelmed by abstraction and pretty consumed by conceptual things, also by Andy Warhol and so on. And they had to retrieve a history of 20th century painting that was alternative to that. And so ultimately my book comes out of that impact, I think. When I met Bhupen Khakhar in 1976, he was a quiet, the phrase he often uses about some of the people he espouses in his own work. He was an insignificant man. He had specs. I actually met him at a show of Howard Hodgkin, who'd become already a close friend of his. And little by little, I think Bhupen grew in stature in my eyes, and I realised what an extraordinary person he was. So that's partly what I'll be talking about. And one of the factors was, I think, his passion for early Italian painting, specifically Sienese, and the kinds of things they do. Let's say, this is the painting that they've used as sort of linchpin of the exhibition, You Can't Please All. It's a painting that by chance I owned for a few years. I sold it to Tate. The curator suddenly rang and asked for it after I'd had it above my bed for 6 years. Okay, so strange story. But he's, it's a self-portrait, a nude self-portrait, it's about 6 foot, and he's looking out over a landscape in which, in a rather Sienese manner, a fable unfolds. And the fable is a famous one. Some of you will know it. The old man, the donkey, and his son, they take a donkey to market together, and wherever they go, they're advised. They're advised, why don't you sit on the donkey? Why is the father sitting on the donkey? Why is the son sitting on it? Why don't you both sit on the donkey? It goes on like that. Now, eventually they carry the donkey. And of course they drop it, and they bury it. And at the moment of burial, the father says to the son, son, I learned one thing today, you can't please all. So it's a good ancient fable. And Bhupen has used it, I think, as his way of literally coming out. He's stripped off. Until then, I met him, he was already 42. This is something like 5 years later, 47. His mother has just died a year before. He's able to say it. But he doesn't say it directly, and it's rather interesting that the parapet is actually protecting him from the world, you see. They only see his upper half. And so there are all sorts of very elements in this painting. And in fact, the person who did a great retrospective in Madrid, Enrico Cousin, said that, it was rather beautiful phrasing, he says something like, it would be easy to see, let me give you this. It is not difficult to see in it the story of someone who buries a burden when revealing their sexuality. And it's a very interesting extra line interpretation. I eventually wrote a book on Bhupen Khakhar, which is the first monograph. And he's one of the sections of this book, which is called The World You Made. And I'm just going to read you, as a way into the talk, the beginning of my section on Bhupen, because it sort of gives you a flavour. So the title of this little section is To Bring Back the Lost Reality of the World. That's actually a phrase of the best Indian art critic, Tate Gallery, who wrote that in around the time that this picture was painted. And also around the time this picture was painted, Bhupen himself writes a text where he says, an artist must be vulnerable. His paintings must reflect all his weak points. I then go on. Much of the history of 20th century painting could be retold as a narrative of artists who, having long since ruled out the option of naturalism, were nevertheless impelled to create a world of figures, to reconstitute the world anew. That was the dilemma facing Bhupen Khakhar, as it had been for Guston, Khakhar, Slade before him, when at the end of the 1960s he tested one mode after another. Could he shape a figurative idiom equivalent to his experience? Around 1972, so that's when he's 38, quite late, around the age of 38, Khakhar's pictorial language gelled. All its hybrid elements fell into place. And it was as though a door suddenly opened onto a vista no painter had penetrated before. The vast terrain of half-westernized modern India. So we're talking about a hybrid art. Let's go on now. I'll go quite fast. Two men in Benares, we'll come back to that picture. They're all, as you can see, squarish. They're all quite large now, by this phase of his life. Another one, Yayati. Another one. Okay. Now, the first kinds of painting that I saw by Bhupen were more modest than those sort of panoramic or explicitly sexual pictures. This would be an example, maybe just a year or two before I met him, and it's called Man Eating Jalebi. Can I just get an idea of how many of you have already seen the show? Rather few. It's been on for about 5 months, and it's going to come off on November the 6th, all right? I do recommend you have a glance. And I love this picture. I love the potential of fantasy that it has of maybe he's just in a cafe. I don't think he's out. My own interpretation is he might not be out there by the sea. He's imagining the state of freedom that one might have if one was by the sea, setting out on a voyage in that solitary boat. But what I want you to notice is the way that this very acute pictorial intelligence is kind of dealing separately with each area, almost eclectically. And that's true, I think, there's a very good film in the show where he's looking, Bhupen, again around this time, around 1980, I think made in 1979, he's looking at the a curtain in his room, and he's imagining what Vuillard would have done with it, what Léger would have done with it. And there's a similar process, I think, area by area going on in this picture. I'm not going to dwell on that. Go on, another one. Okay. I put Bhupen as the honorary Englishman, because he happened to be, he was teaching at Caution, leading art school of the day, living at Howard Hodgkin's house, when I had my first chance to curate. And this was a show called Narrative Paintings. And on the cover was a painting by Tate from 1976. This was in 1979. All right? So it's just 3 years earlier, he painted this very ambitious picture, or If Not Not, which was a sort of public altarpiece-like picture about, I'm not going to go into complex, it's partly about T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and another one, and on the back, next one, and on the back of the cover was a painting by Ken Piff called Talking with a Psychoanalyst. Now, both those pictures recur in my book, and I try and talk about the difference, I think, implicitly between them. One is a public picture, is what I can call a history painting. And the last chapter of the book is called After Abstract Expressionism, Towards a New History Painting. And I actually put Bhupen, Khakhar, into that category. All right. But just before that, there's a section called Beyond the Formalist Canon, Visionaries, Dreamers, Outsiders. And it includes people like Henry Darger, who some of you know, but also Jack Yates, the brother of W.B. Yeats, and Ken Piff, and Jacob Lawrence, a wonderful black American painter. People who don't really fit within the mainstream narrative anyway, but have really something important to say. And I think there are plenty of them in the 20th century. So those would be, and it's not just that Ken Piff is, in my view, a sort of a visionary, a dreamer, a bit of an outsider, but also that he paints with this intimacy that I think, shall we just go back for a moment? You see, I don't think Tate is about intimacy, but many other things. And just to fill you in here, I mean, when he first exhibited his work, and his early work is a bit different, but he was under fire, as he would have been in the 60s and 70s, for being too literary. And I don't know if that's a problem for any of you now. I think it probably isn't. But at the time he made a very good reply. He said, well, some books have pictures and some pictures have books. And I think something like that is worth taking on board. I think it's the links between painting and literature are very rare. And if you lose them, I think you've lost something very important. Now, there's plenty of literature within abstract expressionism, actually, and all those painters were great readers. But nevertheless, there is a way in which the explicit reference and fearless reference to complexity of thought, of literary responses, became taboo in my education, and I had to fight to allow myself to do that again. Another one. So I begin my book with the great painting by Matisse in Russia, The Dance, which is huge when you see it, and which has this sheerness that I think is part of the legacy of the 20th century. And abstract expressionists at their best also have that sheerness. And maybe you'll even feel that some of the painters in my book don't have that. But the simplicity of means is, of course, part of our legacy. Even more important to me is the quality of liberty. I feel that it's about an unbound circle of dances, and that is inherent in the style, it's embodied in the forms, as well as in the ideology. You know, Matisse basically was, in that period, he was an anarchist. And a lot of the artists in my book, actually I'd say my books, have that libertarian slant. And I've taken the politics of art seriously. And I think one of the things that makes my book different, frankly, than most other art historical books, is I take the testimony of artists seriously. It's full of quotation, and I think quotation, for me, is very telling and interesting. Another one. So I deliberately had a strategy of mostly avoiding both Matisse and Picasso. They would have, so to speak, sunk the boat. I wanted to deal with more detail with many artists who are less well known and who are less explored. And so the only Picasso I've included is one when he's just coming out of Cubism into this, what you might call, if you were psychoanalytically inclined, you could call part objects. He's putting together vestiges. It's called Seated Man with Glass. And you just about have the cues and the clues to put him together piece by piece. And it's a marvelous picture, I love it. But I'm trying to make the contrast between that and, let's say, we have another one. This is 40 years later by a fellow cubist who's made a strange journey. This is Fernand Léger at the end of his life, 1954, painting very large, very figurative pictures that nevertheless retained, in my view, some of the radical making a new world, the world new made. And in fact, some of the vision of the possibility of a golden age. And that's, I think, Matisse dance is really a golden age painting. And I bring that in quite a lot in my book. I'll just say what I mean by the golden age. This is a sort of an archetypal thing that people have been talking about for hundreds of years, that there must have been a time before everything solidified into gender, race, nation, religion, all these polarities that define us all, class. There was a time before that. We intuit that. There was a time when humankind was less divided, less. And I think one of the great visions of the 20th century is some glimmer towards that merging. The gender thing is very important in my view. One of the misfortunes of the 20th century in painting terms is that for some reason that I don't fully understand, and now seems very wrong, misguided, feminists who I admired thought that painting became a male preserve. And the students for 20 years at least were steered away from painting, female students, towards conceptual art as, if you like, a non-sexist premise. I think this is important. So, although I quote Rilke's wonderful hope, a great friend of Margaret's article, Paula Modeson-Beck, who's just been a big show in Paris, hoping that there would be this new female painting in the 20th century. To a large extent, it didn't happen. It happened in the 21st century, in my view. And so I think now all of us could name at least 10 very prominent female figurative artists, but we have difficulty in finding those artists in the 20th century, and of course even more difficult in the 19th. Okay, onwards. So that's called the canvas. Just putting them together, I'll just get some sense. What I've said in the first section is that correct formulation. So it's called After Cubism. After Cubism, reinventing the language of representation. I think Cubism opened up language for figurations. In my day, it was more seen as opening up language only for abstraction. But I don't think that's the right perspective. Two more. One more. And the key figure in that really was Henri Rousseau. Strange figure. But because Rousseau hadn't got the burden of academic naturalist training, he was able to make wonderful, memorable figures. I mean, this is from 1905, quite shortly before his death. He came to know personally, of course, Picasso, but also Léger. Robert Delaunay owned 34 Rousseaus. You know, many of the most interesting painters before the First World War, Chagall also, knew Rousseau personally and loved his work and loved the man. And so he becomes a very important figure in history, and is then, I think, very important to Stanley Spencer or Bhupen Khakhar as representing a way of talking about the world, the new world, if you like, the hopeful world, not the decadent world. The new world without all the burdens of bourgeois class and society. And they're tremendously compelling images, another one. And I think, you see, when Leger comes back after the war, he's finished with abstraction. He says he's got his teeth into a new kind of reality. So he paints the mechanic, and he's close to Mondrian at that time, you see. But at the same time, he embeds, as it were, within his Mondrian, he embeds this essentially Rousseau-esque figure. Another one, Carlo Carrà, a futurist, very intelligent futurist, again an anarchist, spends time with De Kuyper, becomes a metaphysical painter, is almost unable to paint for some years because of that metaphysical emphasis, and then begins to produce 2 or 3 absolutely stunning, I think, rare pictures about this is called the House of Love, just before fascism. And then, alas, he gets caught up in fascism, like many Italian figures, and slightly loses his way. But he has a wonderful moment. And Rousseau, I think, is one of the progenitors. The other is Giotto. He's looking at Giotto. And he writes a whole book on Giotto. So there's this new ideology that develops in the middle of the First World War, really, and just after, where artists want to begin again. They've had this terrible destructive war. They want to heal it. They want to put it together again. So that's part of the vision at the beginning of my book. Another one. This is Chagall in 1911, rather early, in Paris. He's got the studio near, close to Leger. Delaunay is very close to him, and he paints big pictures, brave pictures. This one is called the give me the right title. It's rather a lovely title. Half past three, the poet. So it's a nocturne, and I think it's faded a bit. Probably would have been more sense of the moon up there, above the upside down head. But it's about being in the studio late at night, and there's a poem by Alexander Bloch down there. But he's also his friends. He's looking at the same people that Malevich was looking at. Poets of nonsense, in a sense. Klebnikov, getting old. Anyway, these fragmented writers, and of course part of the vision of Cubism, as it spread through the world, was the idea of making art out of the fragmentaries. And Chagall took that fully on board. Then he made a strange, long journey. My essay is really about the journey away from Cubism, which was important to him, towards a more relaxed or less formalized language, especially in his graphic work. And I think the greatest book of the 20th century, the greatest illustrated book, is rather little known still, is Chagall's 100 etchings to dead souls. I'll just show you one. Can we have this one? This is the garden in Gogol's great book, Dead Souls, which happens to have a special meaning for a lot of Russians, because in the middle of this quite cold is the wrong word, but a fast-moving book, he suddenly breaks off to describe, almost for a page, this wonderful garden. This says the landowner's house looks like an invalid on its last legs, but behind it, nature has taken over and has made something that was perhaps banal into something wonderful. And all Russians who read this, Dead Souls was written in exile, in Rome in fact, felt, as I think Chagall felt, that this was an image of liberty and of the possibility of in a way, the disorder taking over. Now, I'm not saying that Cubism is not liberty. although there is, I think, as it hardens into a stylistic thing, much abstraction becomes far from libertarian, in my view. And in fact, if I had to characterise my response to Clifford Still, I would say authoritarian emptiness. And I would say something even worse about certain kinds of Frank Stella. So, but I'm not. I'm absolutely clearly avoiding in the book either an attack on the conceptual or an attack on abstract expression. Some of my best friends are involved in one thing or another, and one can have a good dialogue. But I would like to start a dialogue about this. Another one. Bhupen Khakhar was brought up in a very small, sort of almost like a small town in the middle of Bombay. And if anyone ever been to Bombay, the area where sort of the red light area called Falkland Road is curiously sort of intimate. And close to there, there's Crawford Market and other. I recommend if you do go to Bombay, try and get into this small town area, as it were. So those are his roots. Another one. And he had an odd history. His father had died when he was 4. The mother vested all her hopes in him, put him through accountancy exams. So he became an accountant, very, very well qualified, high ranking, passing out, until he was at least, I think, almost 30, something like 30. And then felt he couldn't go through with it. And of course it was a terrible disappointment to his family. But he found that he just didn't want to be that sort of person. So he signed on for the newly founded art school of Baroda, which was the first art school to be founded since Indian independence. All the other art schools in India were really British colonial affairs with an academic, life drawing based course. He happened also to meet, he didn't have enough money to do a full painting course. He was never really taught painting. But he did a critical course, and this meant that he saw a great deal of art. And he also came under the sway of a marvellous Indian figure. I won't go into that. Someone who lives up in lots of ways, older person. And someone from the Royal College, who met him later, called Jim Donovan, who'd been at the Royal College with Hockney and Gittai, came to Baroda for a year, sent under British Council, and in his own words, gave Bhupen a big dose of pop. And it meant that he started looking at popular art, started looking at the art of the street, which in a way was neglected, was not taken seriously by other Indian painters. In fact, what I would say was avoided. The first works he does are a false lead. He tries for a sort of abstracted sign-like painting. One more. And then, as I say, in his late 30s, about 38, he finds this vein. Mainly, he calls them trade paintings. They're like signboard paintings. And I think they come very directly out of spending a lot of time with shopkeepers in the little bazaar streets in this relatively small town of Baroda, very different to Bombay, where people, stalls open up sort of as evening comes on, and they have this quality of, on the one hand, kind of chemical colours, which is how, certainly until very recently, most Indians seem to want to colour wash their interiors, especially shops, with kind of lurid greens and reds, pinks, and fluorescent lighting. And somehow he makes something very, very tender out of that. At the same time, he's an accountant. And whenever I had a letter from him, it was always itemized. It always said 1, 2, 3, 4. And you feel that he's doing something like that with the watch repairer. The watch repairer himself is doing a very precise thing. So precision is an important part, I think, of his best art. And that, again, it makes the world new with that sort of precision. Another one. Someone at the Tate on, when was it? It was on the day before yesterday, I did a talk at the Tate. They felt that the figure in the middle of this slide, repairing shoes, had some curious affinity, you see. Now, Bhupen was looking tremendously at CDs on this moment. Can we go back? Do you see what he's saying? Another one, and another one. I think this is probably the picture that influenced the mechanic. This is Rousseau's picture of Pierre Loti, French writer, sort of Orientalist writer with his face. And that hand with the cigarette is very like the hand that Slade has with the mechanic. Slade's thinking of Rousseau at that point. And then you have a Bhupen of a fellow accountant from this early period, from about 1972. But he's clearly looking at leisure, isn't he? Don't you think? It's that kind of tubist, as somebody put it, approach to form, to making everything sheen in this strange, strong relief. Another one. One of the first complex pictures in the show is called Man with Bouquet of Plastic Flowers. And it's been described as a sort of messenger from the dead. I think it's someone who's lived, it's about a life lived, and perhaps wasted. I mean, there's a sense in which, he's sitting around, there's an empty table, some snacks consumed, he's off sitting on his swing. It's all, he looks terrible. I mean, it's about somebody whose face has gone black. You see what I'm saying? So it's a sort of apparition. And there is, in fact, a comparable painting next door to it of an English pub, figure from in an English pub who's been drinking himself alone. Used to be owned by Tate Gallery, the figure at the left. I think also that this picture has a reference to, can we have, next, on the one hand, the kind of Sienese painting that both Bhupen and I love. This is what's known as a Vita icon, an icon that has the life around it. And this is what we call an uplift poster in India. There are many such, of, say, Gandhi and his associates, or Gandhi and his acts. So there's a crossover between, on the one hand, early Italian, and on the other hand, popular art. Where the same, this is Simone Martini. Simone Martini is a very sophisticated artist, but he's choosing to paint in a popular mode at this point. Another one. This is a painting that isn't in the show, which is a rather important painting called View from the Tea Shop. Now, the tea shop, the tea stall in India is a very humble thing. It's, probably most of the tea is served in earthenware. Actually, these are white porcelain, I see, but it's a different perspective, the view from the tea shop, than, say, the view from it's as low as you can go in a way. And yet he's elevating it. He's raising it up to this pitch of the insignificant man. And he's beginning to bring in this panoramic dimension, which I think is what does raise the high horizon, the microcosm, building. Yeah?
Is that him on the right?
It is. It is. I didn't really know him. I think he's wearing a moustache now, which is what a lot of unmarried Indians do, as a casting. Another one. This is the big absence, because it's lost. It was lost by Casman, the dealer Casman, and nobody knows what's happened to it. We had bought it, and we all wonder if it will ever turn up again. But it's called the celebration of the Guru's birthday. And I've always taken it to be partly an explicit homage, can we have the next one? To this Lorenzetti, you see, to the Lorenzetti image of the well-governed city. Let's go back. So he's making out of a small Indian town this this what can I say? This collision of forms which creates a city. And in the foreground he has these mostly elderly men, the kind of people he was seeing in his childhood, sitting outside temples, loafing, but giving them, I think, just beginning to give them a slightly sexual tinge. It's a very big painting. So he did it partly because Hodgkin and he visited the great Mantegna room in Mantua, and they challenged one another to paint big. Another one. Gone. And so this was a picture on the easel when I first arrived in Verona. I'd been to India before, but I had no interest when I first went in anything after about 1400. I was only interested in the great Indian monuments. I didn't think there were any paintings in India. Few. There were rather few. I mean, in the sense, there were a million wonderful craftsmen in India. Some of them were painting craftsmen. But people who described themselves as artists would be perhaps only a few hundred. There were perhaps four or five galleries in the whole of India. Now there's a huge boom. I don't know if there are any Indians here, but it's an extraordinary change. The global nature of the art world. It's like frieze that's migrated into every culture, and Indian art fairs is a very important part of the whole nation. At this point, that's not so. I think we'll press on. That's just a photo by me of Bhupen looking out from his favourite vantage point above the main street, what was then the main street of the old town of Verona. It's just that sense of complexity and of life being lived in public that I think I want to give you a sense of. Another one. I drew Bhupen because he'd broken his leg just the day before I arrived on a motorbike. He was a wonderful subject to draw. He was reading papers and heaving, and these are just a couple of many drawings. That one belonged to Kitta, belonged to Alan Ross. And he built his own house, he just built his own house, which was a kind of open thing. Another one. And that's him with his broken leg in plaster, still painting away. And a feature of the show, which I think they tried to solve, I mean, the female curator did much more than the male curator. She, quite rightly, emphasised that alongside the oil painting side of Bhupen, there was this huge production of very, rapid and offhand watercolours. And they're rather beautiful things for watercolour. I mean, let's say that piece of cloth you see by his leg. I saw him in Amsterdam and many other cities, just producing every day, probably, an image. And that was part of his natural gift. The paintings quite different. I mean, the paintings might take him 3 months and go excruciatingly different. And layer upon layer, and scraping and so on. And that was my painting of Bhupen with his elderly lover, retired building contractor. And another one. He did have other lovers. He had, if you like, pickups and parks and so on. But his real emotional life always centred around elderly men. He was what they call a gerontophile. And he made his art about that, which is a unique testament. This is a painting where he's very explicitly set the act of love within a religious setting. This is Benares. And I think that's a very valuable thing. I think he's done something wonderful there. Bhupen wasn't, as it were, he wasn't a believer. Hinduism is strange in that way anyway, but he was someone who had a sense of the newness. And I think it comes through in all the. One thing I hadn't realised till I saw that painting again at the Tate, the strange stance that he's standing on the other person's foot. And it makes a lot of difference, that image. It doesn't matter in my book, in fact. But you know, one starts to see things differently after a while. Julian Bell, who sometimes writes very well, wrote about this in his big compendium about the mirror of the world, the whole of the world up. And he talks about how he feels this painting takes up the quality of Ambrogio Donizetti in Siena, of creating a community. Somehow the world that is, it isn't just about two people, it's not just about itself. That is, the white-haired figure is definitely Bhupen. It's a self-image. But the senses of their being embedded within the social, within the community. And so this is an amazing picture. Now, when I was in Verona in the late 1980s, he just painted this. He just painted this in a very open situation where his studio and painting was visible from the whole street for months on end, but nobody seemed to be shocked. Nevertheless, he felt that it couldn't be exhibited. And so I rolled it up and paid him not very large sum for it, and took it home, and again it was above my bed, and so my wife loved it too. And we eventually sold it to a collector and gave us some money to Bhupen. But I mean, but it was a fantastic painting to have on one's wall. And the theme is the old king in the Mahabharata. Some of you know the Mahabharata, wonderful, the great epic poem of India. Many episodes within it. The old king who becomes impotent and asks his son, the prince, to give him his youth. So it's a very apposite metaphor, if you like, for what Bhupen was doing for these elderly men that he served and gave new life to. So again, it's a self figure. The green figure is a self figure. All right. I've tried, in the centre of my book is a section called First Person Painting. And I've set out from the position, which was not my phrasing, it's the phrasing of someone called Jean Claire, who's a French figure who at one point became the head of the Cassel Museum, the director of the Cassel Museum, that did a lot of the great Pompidou, Centre Pompidou early shows. And Jean Claire asked, at the time of the great show in Venice, celebrating 100 years of the Venice Biennale, he asked, could it be that the 20th century is not the century of abstraction, but of the self-portrait? That's a very provocative thing to say. There's a lot of truth in it. And so he made an exhibition that had hundreds of, many of them great, in my view, 20th century self-portraits. So, for instance, I haven't included this in the lecture, but Paul Modison Becker, half a work is self-portrait. I think some of the greatest paintings by Bonnard are the late self-portraits. I think Beckman's self-portraits are some of his greatest works. Two more. Frida Kahlo, of course, but perhaps not so much the direct self-portraits as a painting, this extraordinary painting called What the Water Gave Me, which is, in my view, a masterpiece, where a kind of self takes shape between her feet and ourselves. It's a kind of, you see what I mean? And she has something marvellous to say, I think. So that's my focus in that essay. Again, the transition of Philip Guston from a kind of gestural, Monet-like abstraction to this almost brutal cartoon language, which many people related to Robert Crumb. Robert Crumb himself felt very close to Guston at this point. So this is a painting called I think it's called Painting, Eating, Sleeping. Okay? But again, the self is there in Guston's later work. and he's talking about, he says, all I wanted to do was tell my story. That was all that was left. So, another one, please. Alice Neal is an example of someone who was completely unknown to me, I'm afraid. I feel so guilty about it. She was born in 1900, she died in 1980. I probably didn't know about Alice Neal until about the year 2000. And so I don't believe that the story is yet being told. I think there's probably lots of, each culture might have an Alice Neal that we haven't yet seen. That's a statement of faith, if you like. But I don't believe that we've got the whole story of the 20th century. This is her last self-portrait, and another one. And these are two of the early, that's the early work about Joe Gould's wonderful attack on masculinity in some ways. And that's the portrait of Warhol at the end of her life, which Marlene Dumas thinks is one of the greatest paintings of the 20th century. Okay, two more. Yeah, back to Bhupen. So there are paintings that I didn't know at all. There's a terrific essay by a great friend of mine who was really he was the person to whom I dedicated the Siena book, Ghulam Mohammed Sheikh, still alive, 79 now, but very, very close to Bhupen. And he's written an essay in the catalogue about this picture, which is called Son is Father to Man. That's an Indianism in a way, he's leaving out the once or twice. But so the son is father to the man. And this idea that one might hold in one's arms a man older than oneself and perhaps one's father, and surrounding it with acts of love of one, well, somebody there is peeing and somebody's very interested in his peeing. Somebody else inside that room is, I think, sodomizing another person. But there's a male-female couple. There might be somebody's putting his hand in between the legs. A dog is getting very excited. So the idea that a lot of sexual activity might happen around the merging, the loss of gender identity, I think is implicit in lots of the later Bhupen. Another one. A man is pregnant with twins. Another one. Old man with 5 penises had runny nose. Another one. These are big watercolours, almost life-size figures. This is really about a wedding couple, both men, and some reference to that strange sect of the Hijira, probably mispronouncing it, which turn up in India, quite large, maybe 100,000 people, who are sort of like castrates, who, they actually they keep their equipment, but they wear female dress, they turn up at weddings. It's a feature of Indian life, which again probably was largely sort of swept under the carpet. Basically, homosexuality, because of British laws, was not legitimised until relatively late, something like I think after 2000, and has now been delegitimised again under the present right-wing government. So the issue of sexual activity. This is Bhupen writing, talking just at the end of his life. It is the British Raj and our Victorian inheritance that has made us timid. At a certain stage in our history, the British made us feel ashamed of our sexuality, of our society's traditionally more open approach to body and sex. This has now made us into a nation of hypocrites. Quite a hard-hitting statement, I didn't know until this. Okay. This is not in the show, so actually I love, got it, called Intimacy, big action. Another one. At a certain point, Bhupen had a distressing thing. He got cataracts, and his work went kind of blurry. This is called Pink City. It may be that also he was open to the idea that the new painting around 1989, let's say, was looser. He looked at Kiefer, he looked at contemporary painting. And so he abandoned painting for a while. He wrote a play which he got produced. He painted the sets of the play. He was in a bad way. And then his eyesight came back. He had operations was successful. And he produced one or two marvellous, this is a late painting called The Goldsmith, which I'm afraid isn't in the show. I think it's a masterpiece, and it is literally a golden age picture for me. And let's have one more. He got cancer, but quite shortly after my book came out. I feel terribly guilty because as tends to happen, you've just written a book on someone, you kind of become a bit numb towards them. And so I didn't really keep in contact with him during those years. I didn't quite realise how ill he was. Eventually died in 2003. But on the way, he produced some extraordinary works. I don't know if I even like them, but you must see them. I mean, this is called something about, it became iron ingots. He was having to have it minimum 4 times a day. His whole body was being humiliated by terrible treatment. He refused to be castrated, which probably would have given him another year of life. Very, very aggressive prostate cancer. And I now know a lot more about all that than I did then. I think they're very interesting pictures at the end of the show. One more. And this is the last painting he painted. And I was talking with the curator of the show. And it's small, it's a little work, not much bigger than this book, called The Idiot. She felt it was about someone being pushed to the brink of bodily humiliation, craziness. So he's taken off one shoe and he's peeing into it. I mean, he was incontinent, as people often are after prostate. Yet there's something radiant, you see. There's sort of gold. This is gold. So it's a remarkable oeuvre. I mean, there are a lot of things that aren't represented in the show. And why I had reservations is that Tate have a rigidity by which you either have 5 rooms or 17 rooms. And those of you who've seen the Georgia O'Keeffe will probably feel, as I feel, that although I think I'm glad I saw it, it was slightly overextended to the show. 17 rooms was too much. 5 rooms is certainly too small for Bhupen. It's crammed in. It isn't right. But anyway, that's how the Tate is run. And there are a few doubts. I mean, I'm the first to agree. I don't think Bhupen is all gold. But I think he's fascinating. Thank you, anyway. So if we've got time, are we allowed to?
We'll transfer. Tim will speak into the microphone and just the usual microphones.
And do leave. Those of you who want to leave, please leave. And there's some stuff down here as well. Any questions? Anyone want to open the question?
The microphone will be brought.
So, anyone want to open the question?
I was wondering if you, it seems to be in some of his paintings he would show a kind of sexual scene between an older guy and a younger guy. And he said that he had a sexual kind of preference towards older men. So that would have suggested that was going on when he was a younger man, but then was he painting the paintings when he was also an older man? So kind of who was he in the sexual encounter? Was he kind of both people?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, when I first knew Bhupen, although I myself was probably sexually confused, he just seemed confused or not. I mean, like me, he'd read Dostoevsky's The Idiot and loved the figure of Prince Myshkin. He was a sort of perhaps asexual figure, I thought. I think that probably wasn't true. I think he probably was picking up people and so on. I think Bhupen loved the whole spectrum of sexuality. I may not have answered your question properly. Are you saying?
I just thought it was kind of interesting thing to do.
Sorry.
I just thought it was really interesting.
I mean, obviously there would be a very big difference between you see, they use this word intergenerational. Now, very often that would mean, say, a 15-year-old and a 20-year-old or a 25-year-old. But that isn't the point. The point is it's very specific. He's certain he lost his father at 4. It's crude to say that, but it's true. He is, in a sense, finding a father, and specifically, I mean, I'll give you a quotation from Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh about these elderly men. He saw it much more clearly than me. He said, they were men with spent lives, longing for tenderness, extremely vulnerable, some even knocking at death's door, waiting endlessly for a miracle to rekindle that spark. It's a rather specific thing. It's not just, as it were, intergenerational. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't quite get when he was painting, I know, for example, the one where someone's standing or someone's foot.
Yeah.
Was he kind of an older man then?
No, I don't think so. Well, I mean, he is older than that. You're right. That's another area. You're right. Yeah.
Just then it could be like him.
But I think the dominant thrust you'll see in the show is more that all barriers break. I mean, I think he's a liberating artist in that way. You see, I think he's saying anything could happen in love, and he's not, as it were, doing gay lib propaganda. Yeah. Which I would approve of too, but another question, please. Yeah. Can I just say one other thing? That when I wrote the book, I very much wrote about Bhupen as the product of a whole lot of artists in Baroda. I chose now not to do that. I mean, I see him more in the context of generally 20th century art. But that's the choice we all have to make when we talk about an artist. Do we talk about the way they grew within a context, or do we talk about them the way they're situated within our culture, within our international, global situation? It's a choice in a way. Sorry.
Yes, you were talking about these narrative paintings from the 20th century. Do you see that that is something that is coming back now?
As I think I said, the last section is called Towards a New History Painting. The last artist I deal with, Leon Golub. Did any of you see the remarkable Serpentine Gallery show? I'll give you... he's a very, very witty writer on art. I do recommend him as Kentridge is the next, William Kentridge is the next last artist. Neo Rauch is the one before. There's a show of Neo Rauch just opened at David's Werner. I don't know what I'm going to make of it. That's the first real show there's ever been of Neo Rauch in London. But the whole Leipzig phenomenon is very big worldwide.
William Kentridge is doing a lecture next week.
Doing a lecture next week. He's on at the Whitechapel Gallery right now.
I mean,
here, yes, I've heard, I know, it's very interesting. This is Leon Golub in the 80s. He says, I think of my work as history painting, and I think of history painting as being public, but it's ambiguously public because it's modern history painting. So you get the drift. Does that reply to your?
Yeah, was it?
Yeah. So you see, narrative is one word. History painting might be another. It's not quite the same thing, but it's heading there. Yeah. Somebody.
Thank you for the talk. My question kind of relates to the last one, because I found the relationship you mentioned about the self and the world very interesting, with the references from early 20th century from the First World War, this kind of liberty
Yep.
and New World started to appear in painting as a representation of the world. So I'm thinking maybe instead of narrative painting coming back, is it, considering narrative painting or history painting in the past always about this grand narrative, maybe from the 20th century, the narrative painting or history painting, the focus of it becomes more about the personal or the self or the
This is the
or
thing.
representing the world through a personal perspective.
I'm sure a lot of people here know that feminist slogan, the personal is political. The personal is political. That was one of the great feminist slogans of the 80s. So I wouldn't necessarily oppose the personal and the political, you see. But as to coming back, I mean, I think the real message of this book is it never went away. There were always people telling their stories in painting, right through the 20th century. So coming back means what? Fashion, or somebody's pressed a button, or what are we saying there? I think we have complete freedom to paint as we want. That's what I think we shouldn't be too attentive to flavour of the decade. Does that answer or not?
I guess I'm not asking about, it's not really about the politics of it. It's more like, could we call this as history painting? Like, because I feel like this type of artists, even Tate and Gola, they're dealing with history. They're trying to use painting to represent the world, and there seems to be something there from the artist's own perspective, somehow represent worldwide events and history of the time. So, and also I'm thinking what painting, the role of painting and how painting can play a significant role in this field.
Yeah. Well, I hope that the book would suggest just how many languages there are for this. But, I mean, I don't say too much about collage, but nevertheless, something like a collage aesthetic is often implicit, I think, putting together many things. And even someone like Kentridge, the sort of morphing that goes on in those early films has elements of collage in a way. One thing becomes another. I find that the experience of watching, say, Felix in Exile. I haven't actually seen the Whitechapel show. I don't think it's there, is it? I don't think they've got the early films, or have they? At the Whitechapel Gallery, do they have the early Kentridge films? They're basically drawings projected, but each time not knowing the direction they're going in. So the narrative is unknown to him until he's done something. Anyway. Is that enough? Or do you want more? Anyone more?
Questions?
Any more? Oh, all right.
Thank you for the talk.
Talk loud because I'm pretty
Sorry.
bit deaf.
Thank you for the talk. I was just interested. Do you make a point in the book that you've just published and other things that you've published to emphasise the work of painters who are women, generally speaking?
Sorry, what's the question?
Sorry. Well, it's called your book Alternative History, and I'm interested as an alternative history of painting. Do you make a point of going out of your way to make sure that you include work by painters who are women?
Go out of my way. I don't think I go out. Sorry. I don't think I go out of my way, but I think that, as in all I think 6 or 7 women is probably about the reality. 6 or 7 out of 70 is probably the sort of ratio you get in the 20th century.
Okay.
So I mean, but it isn't that sort of book. It's not a survey, and the people I leave out are some of my favourite artists. It's really about who felt I could write in some fresh way, and find something new to say about it.
Okay.
So, that's what determines the choice, whether of men or women. Is that enough?
Yeah, thank you, that's fine.
Yeah. But I mean, let's face it, you're half right, that one has got to, I was very pleased that the recommendation came from Linda Nochlin, who's the greatest feminist critic of our time. So that was a big help.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.